In 19.3, we're going to talk about adaptive evolution. So by the end of this section, you should be able to explain the different ways that natural selection can shape populations and describe how these different forces can lead to different outcomes in terms of the population variation. So natural selection, remember, acts on the population's heritable traits, things that can be passed on from one generation to the next. It can't operate on things that don't get passed on. And so when we talk about populations like this and talk about adaptation, when natural selection acts positively and encourages a trait being passed on from generation to generation, that's called adaptive evolution. And similarly, when a trait doesn't help an organism and it gets weeded out of the population. And so this is an organism's evolutionary fitness. Fitness is usually quantifiable as the number of offspring produced and is often measured by scientists like me in the field. So there are several different ways that adaptive evolution can happen in a population, and those are the things that we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about stabilizing selection, directional selection, diversifying selection, frequency-dependent selection, and sexual selection. I know that's a lot, but a lot of it is very easy to understand. So in stabilizing selection, that's when selection forces create like one version of a thing that's super successful. And so the example in the book is a mouse that blends against the foliage on the forest floor. If the mouse is too dark, it's going to get weeded out by predators. If it's too light, it's going to get weeded out by predators. And so there's a very narrow set of colors in mice that help them blend in with the forest floor. And that's what stabilizing selection is. This idea, if you go too far to the left or too far to the right, it's going to negatively impact your ability to reproduce and have successful offspring. Directional selection is kind of the opposite of that. And so directional selection is when evolutionary forces are pushing you towards something. So let's say for whatever reason, the foliage on the forest floor for these mice was getting darker. At that time, if you had lighter mice, they were going to be negatively affected. But if you have darker mice, they're going to like succeed and succeed and succeed. And so the overall average color in the population of the mice will slowly get darker and darker and darker. And that's all directional selection is. And there's this really classic example of moths and pollution in the UK, and I encourage you to read the book about that and also click on the link to learning with the article questioning that example of directional selection. So diversifying selection is when you have kind of two or more stable populations with different phenotypes. And so we see this in birds with alpha males and sneaky males. So alpha males are really dominant, really aggressive. They always get their, they get to successfully mate. If you're not an alpha male, though, and you're not getting a chance to mate, obviously that's not a very good solution for you in terms of fitness. And so the second phenotype has emerged in a lot of different bird species called the sneaky male. And so the sneaky male will kind of sneak in when the alpha males don't notice or aren't around, and they manage to copulate that way. And so this is diversifying selection because these two different strategies are both pretty successful, but birds that don't land on those are selected against. Okay, so in frequency-dependent selection, certain frequencies are good for a particular phenotype, but then if they start to grow too popular, they get punished for it. I think about an example in ecology a lot with this of mimics. And so I think we'll learn about mimics later, but the monarch butterfly is actually poisonous, but the viceroy butterfly, which looks very similar, is not. So frequency-dependent selection occurs there as well, because if the viceroys, the non-poisonous ones, become too common, then predators will start eating all the orange and black butterflies because they don't think that they're dangerous. But if they're less common, then the predators that select monarch butterflies immediately spit them out because they're gross and they're poisonous, and then the viceroys are protected from that. And so that's not frequency-dependent selection within a particular species, but kind of across two species. But that example, to me, makes more sense than, or is easier to understand than the example that's provided in the book. Another type of selection is called sexual selection. It's what you think. It's all these crazy things in nature like the bright red in cardinals and bird dimorphism in general, having a male version and a female version of a bird. Peacocks, peahen, different spiders have sexual selection for size, all these sorts of things. Any selection pressure on an individual's sex that occurs during mating is sexual selection. You know, if the girls want the prettiest boy, then by golly, evolution is going to produce the prettiest boy. So that wraps up the section on adaptive evolution. Obviously, there's no perfect organism, and lots of organisms will evolve and kind of change based on their fitness. We might see one type of selection in a population over here, and then in another part of the country, we will see a different type of selection. Selection is really interesting because it helps us understand the overall evolutionary process. All right, see you in the next video.